Estimations of the Marianas' pre-colonial population usually range from as low as 20,000 to as high as 100,000. Which estimation is correct? Guahusi Pulan, and to find out the most likely pre-colonial Marianas population size, we must understand the methodology behind the estimations. Since no formal population census of the Marianas was taken until 1710, which is well after the Spanish conquest and subsequent Marianas depopulation, we must rely on other forms of evidence. The two main lines of evidence that people use to develop their population estimates are early missionary and European accounts and house counts. In addition to using these two forms of evidence, I will also do a comparative analysis of various pre-colonial population numbers of the Marianas with other Pacific islands. The earliest written estimate of the Marianas population was by Fray Juan Pobre in 1602, who resided in Rota for 7 months. He wrote that there were more than 60,000 Chamorros living in nearly 400 villages on Guam and around 12,000 living in around 50 villages on Rota, for a combined total of about 72,000 people. Unfortunately, Pobre does not provide exact numbers for the rest of the Marianas, other than saying that they are known to be heavily populated. Although if we were to extrapolate these known numbers to the rest of the islands, the total Marianas population would easily exceed 100,000. The next known population estimate was made 6 decades later by Jesuit missionaries who temporarily stopped by the Marianas on the way to the Philippines in 1662. They claimed that there were about 50,000 people on Guam and 40,000 for the rest of the Marianas. In total, we get 90,000, or if we round it up, 100,000 for the entire Marianas. The 50,000 number for Guam is again found in 2 separate letters by 2 Jesuit priests, Father Salvatoris and Casanova, dated to 1668. Proponents of the highest population estimates of 100,000 or more point to these early missionary accounts as evidence for their claims. However, these numbers are most likely incorrect and exaggerated for several reasons. First, early population estimates by Europeans of Pacific Islanders are widely considered by their contemporaries and scholars to be unreliable, as they are based entirely on guesswork within a short time period. I mean, Salvatoris and Casanova made their 50,000 population claim for Guam literally within 4 days after they arrived on Guam. In addition, the missionaries may have been blinded by religious zeal. Second, these early missionaries likely had an incentive to exaggerate the population in order to support their missionary work. It looks much better for the missionaries to claim that they can potentially save 50,000 souls on Guam or 100,000 souls in the entire Marianas than say only 30,000 souls in the Marianas. Third, later missionary sources gives vastly different numbers. One primary source about the early description of the Marianas by the Jesuit missionaries states that the population of Guam was 20,000 rather than 50,000. The next source, which is probably the most reliable source concerning the Marianas population at the time, was by Belgian priest Peter Coomans. Coomans arrived in the Marianas in 1672 and wrote a history covering the mission in the Mariana Islands from the year 1667 until 1673. In this history, he wrote the most detailed accounts of the Marianas population at the time. Coomans estimated that the total population of the Marianas is at around 24,400, with 12,000 on Guam, 2,000 on Rota, 300 on Aguiguan, 3,000 on Tinian, 6,000 on Saipan, 500 on Anatahan, 200 on Saragan, 100 on Guguan, and 300 on Alamagan. It is likely the total Marianas population is a little higher than 24,400 because Coomans does not provide population numbers for the other 4 inhabited islands. Coomans' estimation of 24,400 is on the lower end, in contrast to the previous missionary accounts, which are on the higher end. What explains the contrast? Perhaps, as already suggested, the numbers given by the previous accounts were exaggerated because they were made in haste, blind zeal, and to support the missionary work. In contrast, Coomans, had the advantage of time and was able to gather information from the already established Spanish mission. Thus, he was able to take a more scientific approach, carefully considering the numbers as evidenced by his detailed numbers for specific islands. Furthermore, Coomans' apparent low estimation is not entirely unreasonable when we consider that the Marianas population was probably already on the decline even before the missionaries arrived in 1668, and the cause of this decline was European-introduced diseases. After all, the Chamorros made first contact with Europeans in 1521. There was especially heavy contact after 1565, where according to scholar Marjorie Driver, more than 100 ships passed through the islands during the period 1565 to 1668, most in convoys of 2 or more vessels, which carried several hundred people. And during this period, a substantial number of people from ships are known to have remained for fairly lengthy stays among the Chamorros. Most were survivors of shipwrecks, and some even remained in the islands for the rest of their lives. Clearly, during the century and a half of European contact, there were enough opportunities for new diseases to decimate the Marianas population to, at the very minimum, of 24,400 by the early mission period. Does this mean then that the population was 100,000 prior to 1668, as the early sources suggested? Probably not. If we assume that the population was 100,000 in 1662, as the Jesuits claim, this would mean that nearly 4/5 of the Chamorro population declined by the time the early mission was set up. What seems more likely? That nearly 4/5 of the Marianas population died from diseases within a decade, which would be unprecedented in the region, or that the Marianas population was actually lower than previously reported by these unreliable sources. Now, there are a few sources that estimate the Marianas population after 1673 and before the population census in 1710, which counted 3,539 inhabitants. In 1683, Francisco Salgado wrote in a letter that there were about 13,000 inhabitants. In 1690, Jose Hernandez wrote that there were either about 7,800 or 8,800 Chamorros in the Marianas. A church census in 1705 indicated that the population was 5,523. If we were to take all these numbers to face value, then we see about a 90% population reduction from 24,400 at minimum in 1668 to 3,539 by 1710. There are other sources that estimate the pre-colonial population, although these sources were written after the colonization of the Marianas. In a letter written in 1709, the Marianas governor Juan Antonio Pimentel writes that there were 24,000 inhabitants when the Jesuits arrived. Pimentel's source possibly could have been from Coomans. In 1772, Frenchman Julien Crozet says that the Marianas was about 60,000 at the time of discovery, although his numbers appears completely made up because he doesn't give any reasoning behind it. In 1819, Frenchman Louis de Freycinet writes there were 73,000 inhabitants in the Marianas in 1668 or before the Spanish. Freycinet's information is based on the notes by the late 18th century Marianas governor Tobias, who wrote that there were a little over 50,000 Chamorros in Guam, Rota, and Tinian. Freycinet then extrapolates these numbers to the rest of the Marianas, getting 73,000. However, it is unclear what method or source Tobias used to get his 50,000 number. In an 1821 publication, Russian Otovan Kotzebue writes that the original population of the Marianas, according to Fray Juan de la Concepcion, was 40,000, according to Morello Villard, 44,000. These two men made these estimations in the 18th century. It's difficult to say how reliable any of these numbers are because we either don't know the sources they are citing or the reliability of the sources for those we do know. Let us consider another way to estimate the Marianas population. Counting housing units is a common method for making population estimations. By knowing the total amounts of houses of an area and assigning a number of inhabitants per house, it is possible to estimate the population of said area. Fortunately, the missionaries recorded the number of villages and an estimated range of houses for large and small villages. So it is possible to make estimations based on housing units. Unfortunately, this information was only recorded for Guam. The way around this is to estimate Guam's population based on the housing counts and then extrapolate the estimated number to the rest of the Marianas. The missionaries recorded 180 villages on Guam, and depending on which source you use, there are anywhere from 50 to 150 houses in the larger villages and 6 to 20 houses in the smaller villages. Based on this house count method, in 1904, German Governor Fritz concluded that the population of Guam to be 30,000. Fritz then extrapolates that the Marianas could have reached 100,000. Another population estimate based on house counts gives a much smaller number than Fritz. In a 1982 article, Jesuit priest Francis Hazel concludes that the population of Guam to be about 20,000 or 30,000, and claims that the likely population range for the entire Marianas was between 35,000 to 50,000, with 40,000 to be the working hypothesis. He acknowledges in a later 1989 publication that the pre-colonial population of Marianas may have been considerably lower than 40,000 and makes 40,000 the upper limit. Hazel's estimation is likely more reliable than Fritz. Hazel is a prolific publisher and scholar in the region of Micronesia, having lived and worked in the region since 1963. Based on his extensive knowledge and experience, he is critical of high population estimates. As Hazel puts it, proponents of a higher figure often forget two critical facts about traditional populations. First, a count of house sites can be misleading, since on the high islands of Micronesia, house sites, even entire villages, were frequently abandoned in ancient times. Thus, a population based on a count of house platforms would invariably be inflated. Second, subsistence agricultural practices require the underutilization of available land resources for various reasons. Armchair demographers tend to exaggerate the size of the population that a given landmass could have supported. Interestingly, in one of the primary sources dated to around the early mission period that gives the villages and housing estimates, concludes that based on the villages and houses, the population of Guam would be about 20,000, which is in line with the lower estimation range of Hazel. If we combine Hazel's figures with Coomans, then during the early mission period, the Chamorro population was somewhere between 24,400 and 40,000. To further refine our estimated range, we will compare the various numbers given for the Marianas pre-colonial population with other Pacific Island groups. We will use population density as the unit of comparison. Population density is measured by the number of inhabitants per square mile in order to control for land size. The data for the other islands are based on some of the early and somewhat more reliable pre-colonial population estimates. Generally speaking, for this data set, prior to colonization, Pacific Island groups do not generally exceed 200 inhabitants per square mile. This is further evidence that the high estimations for the Marianas by some of the early accounts, which all exceed 200 inhabitants per square mile, are indeed likely exaggerations. Population densities approaching 200 is pushing the acceptable upper limit, making the 73,000 figure given by Freycinet unlikely. Population densities near 100 appear more reasonable as an upper limit, with the 40,000 suggestion by Hazel falling right at 102 inhabitants per square mile and 50,000 suggested by Spoor at 128 inhabitants per square mile. A population of 60,000 is also a possible upper limit, especially considering that the Zamora population was likely already on the decline due to European introduced diseases before 1668. We already established Coomans' figure of 24,400 as the lower limit for the Zamora population at the time of the early Spanish mission. 24,400 translates to 69 inhabitants per square mile. Coincidentally, this figure is near the population densities of island groups in Micronesia, such as Fray and Pobre. Thus, the pre-colonial Marianas population is likely between 24,000 and 40,000 in 1668, and the population could have been as high as 60,000 in the 16th century. And if you think an upward limit of 60,000 for the Marianas is too low, consider this. Fiji has about 18 times more land area than the Marianas, yet the number of 300,000 indigenous Fijians as claimed by an early source is considered by many in overestimation. More conservative sources would place the pre-colonial population of Fiji to around 150,000 or 200,000. In conclusion, the pre-colonial Marianas population is probably in between the range of 24,000 to 60,000, likely being in the higher estimation range in the 16th century, gradually declining due to introduced diseases by Europeans, to the lower estimation range by the early period of the Spanish mission in the Marianas between 1668 to 1673. This estimated range fits with the three available lines of evidence of early accounts, housing counts, and population comparisons among Pacific islands. As a result of warfare between the Spanish and Zamora forces, epidemics, the reducción policy, and colonization, the Zamora population was reduced to 3,539 by 1710, a 90% population loss. Sitsus Masi for watching. Guahusi Pulan Esta.